People like you don't belong in first class." The words were still playing back through Simone Carter's earbuds when the cabin fell completely silent around her, and she realized that the most important thing she had done in her 17 years of life was press record. The phone screen cast a pale blue glow across her face in the dimmed cabin, illuminating the streaks that tears had left on her cheeks before she had made herself stop crying and made herself start thinking instead, because her mother had taught her a long time ago that in moments like this, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm enough to document what is happening to you. The recording was clear, shockingly, almost surreally clear. Diane Hartley's voice came through with the kind of precision that left absolutely no room for interpretation, no wiggle space for a lawyer to argue context, no shadow of ambiguity that a corporate spokesman could hide behind. Every syllable was captured, every consonant, every drop of contempt that had been loaded into those 9 words like a weapon. Simone sat very still in seat 3, her portfolio bag tucked at her feet, her wine-stained navy blazer folded on her lap, because she could not bear to leave it in the overhead bin where she could not see it, where someone might touch it or move it, or make her feel even more like she did not belong in the space she had every right to occupy. Outside the window, Boston's skyline was beginning to appear through the clouds, distant and cold and indifferent, and somewhere below those clouds was Harvard University, where she was supposed to be interviewing for early admission tomorrow morning, wearing that blazer, that carefully chosen blazer that she had pressed herself the night before because first impressions matter, and she had been taught to show up, prepared to show up, ready to show up, as if she had every right to be in any room she walked into. She had done everything right. She had the boarding pass. She had the seat. She had done nothing except exist in a space that one woman had decided entirely on her own authority, and her own assumptions was not meant for someone who looked like Simone. What Diane Hartley did not know, what no one on that plane knew except Simone herself, was that her mother was Dr. Renee Carter, and that Dr. Renee Carter's name, when spoken in certain rooms in Washington, D.C., had a way of making very powerful people go very quiet very quickly. The plane began its descent. Simone exhaled slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to breathe before a debate round when the pressure was high and the stakes were real. She looked down at her phone one more time, confirmed that the backup was uploading to the cloud, and then she made herself a promise in the silence of that descending cabin. She was not going to be silent about this. Not for anything. 3 months before she ever set foot on Horizon Airlines Flight 247, Simone Carter was standing behind the counter of a dry cleaning shop on 63rd Street at 7 in the morning, steaming someone else's wedding dress and thinking about Harvard. She had been thinking about Harvard for 2 years, which was how long she had been working 3 part-time jobs simultaneously: the dry cleaner on weekday mornings before school, a tutoring center on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and weekend shifts at a South Side community center, where she ran an after-school debate program for middle schoolers who reminded her of herself at 12 kids who were sharp and hungry, and needed someone to tell them that their sharpness was an asset and not a threat. She had saved carefully, methodically, the way her mother had taught her to approach any goal that mattered: break it into steps, work each step without skipping, and do not let anyone rush you or discourage you or convince you that the destination is not worth the walk. The Harvard interview had come through in October, a formal invitation from the admissions office in response to Simone's application. Her transcripts, her test scores that had sat at the top of her class for 3 consecutive years, her letters of recommendation from her debate coach and the director of the Community Food Access Program she had started when she was 15, after noticing that 3 of the families in her building did not have reliable access to fresh produce within walking distance. The program had expanded over 2 years from a single Saturday distribution point to a network of 6 neighborhood pickup locations that served over 400 families a month, and the Harvard interviewer had specifically mentioned it in the invitation letter, noting that her approach to identifying a community need and building an infrastructure to address it demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative the university valued. Simone had read that sentence 11 times. Her mother, Dr. Renee Carter, had not read it 11 times because Dr. Renee Carter was not by nature a person who repeated herself or lingered on good news longer than it took to absorb it and move forward. She was a woman of focused forward motion, someone who had spent 20 years in civil rights law, building a reputation for being the person you called when an institution had done something wrong and needed to be held fully accountable for it, and who had been appointed 8 months ago to head the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division after a career that had left a trail of landmark cases and shattered precedents in its wake. She was brilliant and formidable and deeply private, and she had raised Simone with deliberate intention to be independent, to stand on her own merits, to never use her mother's name as a door opener or a shield. "You have to earn everything yourself," Dr. Carter had told her when Simone was 12, and a teacher had suggested subtly but unmistakably that perhaps Simone's exceptional essay had been assisted by someone at home. "Because the day you rely on my name, you start to doubt whether you could have done it without it. And I need you to always know that you could." Simone had taken that to heart in the way that children take to heart the things their parents say, that land with the weight of something true. She had earned her grades, her debate championships, her program, her Harvard interview, every single piece of it, through work that had nothing to do with who her mother was. The night before the flight, Dr. Carter had knocked on Simone's bedroom door while she was laying out her interview outfit, for the 3rd time adjusting the angle of the blazer's collar against the shirt, making sure everything was precisely right. Her mother had been holding something, a printed boarding pass, fresh from the printer, with Simone's name and a seat assignment in the first-class cabin. "I used my miles," her mother had said, simply setting it on the desk. "Your first college interview deserves to be special." Simone had looked at the boarding pass for a long moment, feeling the particular combination of gratitude and pressure that her mother's gestures sometimes produced in her, the awareness that love in their household often arrived in the form of high expectations wrapped in something warm. She had hugged her mother, who had hugged her back with one of those brief, firm embraces that communicated more than a longer one would have. "You've prepared for this, Doctor," Carter said against her hair. "You know the material, you know yourself. Walk in there like you belong, because you do." Simone had spent the rest of the evening pressing her blazer, organizing her portfolio, transcripts, letters of recommendation, program, statistics, interview, prep notes, and going to bed at 10:30 with her alarm set for 5. She was not nervous. Or rather, she was the particular kind of nervous that feels like readiness when you have done the work, the feeling that has a sharp edge to it, but sits still inside you rather than running around, making noise. She could not have known, lying in the dark of her bedroom on the south side of Chicago, that the blazer she had pressed so carefully and the portfolio she had organized so thoroughly would both be soaked in red wine before the day was over, and that the damage done to them would be the least significant thing that happened to her on that flight. O'Hare International Airport at 6:15 in the morning has a particular energy to it that Simone had always found strangely clarifying the sense of so many different lives intersecting briefly in the same fluorescent-lit space, before dispersing again toward entirely different destinations, the rolling suitcases and the coffee cups, and the children who had been woken too early and were being carried through security by parents who were visibly running on determination alone. Simone moved through it efficiently, her portfolio backpack on both shoulders, her carry-on rolling behind her with the slight rattle of the tile floor, her boarding pass on her phone already pulled up and ready. She had given herself extra time the way she gave herself extra time for everything that mattered, building in the buffer that allowed her to be unhurried even when the circumstances tried to make her rush. Gate 14 was already populated when she arrived. Business travelers in expensive coats, a couple who appeared to be on their way to a long vacation based on the matching luggage tags, a few solo travelers arranged in the particular fortress-like postures of people who had learned to create privacy in public spaces. Simone found a seat near the window, set her bag down, and took out her interview prep notes for one final pass running through the questions her debate coach had helped her anticipate, and the answers she had refined through 6 practice rounds over the past 3 weeks. She was not the only young person at the gate, but she appeared to be the only young person in the first-class boarding group. A fact that generated exactly the kind of subtle social attention she had learned to notice, without responding to the quick glances that lasted half a second longer than they needed to. The slight recalibrations of expression when someone's eyes moved from her face to her boarding pass and back. She had been navigating this particular texture of the world since she was old enough to understand what it meant, and she had developed the same response her mother had modeled for her. Notice it file. It keep moving. It was when the boarding announcement came and Simone joined the first-class line that she noticed Diane Hartley for the first time. The lead flight attendant was stationed at the cabin door greeting passengers as they stepped off the jet bridge, and she had the particular posture of someone who had been doing this long enough to have opinions about it. Shoulders straight, smile, precisely calibrated name tag positioned exactly on her lapel. Her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a style that seemed designed to communicate authority. She was greeting the businessman ahead of Simone with the kind of warm familiarity that hospitality professionals deploy when they want a passenger to feel genuinely welcomed, and Simone noticed, filing it away without judgment, that the warmth shifted, not disappeared exactly, but shifted when the businessman stepped through and Simone stepped forward in his place. Diane Hartley looked at Simone the way people sometimes do when they have already decided what they are seeing before they have finished looking. Her eyes moved to the boarding pass. She took it, examined it, flipped it over in a way that was not procedurally necessary, held it up briefly toward the light of the jet bridge as though checking for something that she expected to find and was mildly disappointed not to. All of this happened in about 15 seconds, which was approximately 12 seconds longer than it had taken for anyone else's boarding pass to be processed. "First class is to the left," Diane said, returning the pass in a tone that managed to function simultaneously as information and instruction and doubt. "I know," Simone said pleasantly. "Thank you." She did not look back as she walked down the aisle to seat 3A. But she was aware of Diane's gaze following her in the way you are sometimes aware of something without being able to explain how you know it. Seat 3. A was a window seat with wide leather cushions and a folded blanket on the armrest that felt expensive, the kind of small detail that communicates to a passenger that their comfort has been anticipated. Simone stowed her carry-on, settled in, and began arranging her materials on the tray table. Portfolio open interview prep notes on top, a bottle of water she'd bought in the terminal standing to the side. She was calm and organized and ready, and she was trying very deliberately to let the last 30 seconds go because she had learned that you could spend enormous amounts of energy on small moments of other people's assumptions, and she had more important things to spend her energy on today. The woman across the aisle in 3B settled in quietly. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 70s with silver hair worn in a classic, understated style, dressed in a well-tailored travel suit that had the quality of something worn many times rather than something new and impressive. She offered Simone a brief, genuine smile, the kind that did not require anything back, and turned to look out her own window. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she had spent 31 years as a federal judge, and she had an extremely well-trained eye for situations that were not what they appeared to be on the surface. She had noticed Diane Hartley's greeting. She had said nothing about it, but she had noticed it. When the other first-class passengers finished boarding, none of whose boarding passes received anything like the scrutiny Simone's, had Eleanor Voss arranged her reading glasses on her nose and opened her book, and she watched quietly as the flight preparation began, The pre-departure service on Horizon Airlines Flight 247 began approximately 12 minutes after the cabin doors sealed, with Diane Hartley moving smoothly through the first-class section with a tray of beverages: orange juice, sparkling water, champagne for those who wanted it, and the particular professional warmth she deployed for passengers she had already decided deserved it. Simone watched this happen from seat 3A with the same attentiveness she brought to everything she observed, which was the attentiveness of someone who had grown up in a household where her mother read situations for their deeper logic as a matter of professional survival. Diane paused at each row, made eye contact, smiled genuinely enough to be convincing, exchanged small pleasantries with the businessman who'd been ahead of Simone in the boarding line, offered the couple across the aisle their choice of beverages with the enthusiasm of someone who meant it. When she reached row 3, she served the passenger in 3B Eleanor Voss, who accepted sparkling water with a quiet thank you, and then turned and continued up the aisle without pausing at 3A. Simone waited a reasonable moment, then raised her hand with the polite restraint of someone who had been taught that small dignities matter. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Diane turned back briefly, her expression carrying the particular neutrality of someone who has decided not to be hostile but has not decided to be helpful either. "I'll be back around," she said, and continued forward. She did not come back around. The cabin moved through its pre-departure sequence: safety announcements, seatbelt checks, tray tables secured, and the water Simone had requested never materialized. She had her own bottle from the terminal, which she was grateful for, but she had noticed what had happened in the way you notice something that you are already accumulating evidence about each instance, small on its own, and together adding up to something that is not small at all. The taxi to the runway began, and Diane moved through the first-class cabin, doing final checks, securing overhead bins, reminding passengers to stow devices. When she arrived at Simone's row, she looked at the portfolio materials spread across the tray table, the transcripts and recommendation letters and carefully organized interview prep that Simone had been reviewing, and said curtly and without particular interest in whether it was convenient, "You'll need to put those away for takeoff." "Of course," Simone said, and began gathering them carefully, sliding the papers back into their plastic protective sleeves because she had brought plastic sleeves precisely because she was careful about things that mattered to her. She had just reached for the last sheet when it happened. It was a water pitcher half full that Diane had been carrying in the other hand for the last stage of her aisle walk, and the manner in which it tilted was the kind of tilt that looks like an accident if you are not paying attention and looks like something else. If you are, because there was no turbulence, no stumble, no sudden shift in the plane's motion that would explain why the pitcher angled precisely over Simone's tray table and released a slow, thorough pour directly across the portfolio materials, her transcripts, her recommendation letters, her printed interview prep notes. Every document she had prepared and organized and brought as her preparation for the most important conversation of her academic life, now soaked through and blurring at the edges as the water spread. "Oh," Diane said, her voice carrying the particular note of theatrical concern that is distinguishable from genuine concern by the absence of any actual urgency behind it. "I'm so sorry about that." Simone's hands, moving quickly to try to salvage what she could, trembled slightly, not from distress, but from the specific physical response to the effort of staying composed when every instinct is pulling in the other direction. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She pressed her lips together and lifted the papers that could still be saved, and let the ones that couldn't be lifted lie flat. Diane leaned in slightly and said in a tone that was barely above a murmur aimed only at Simone in the general noise of the cabin, "These seats are usually for our regular customers who know the drill." She returned with cocktail napkins, thin, barely absorbent ones designed for drink spills, not document recovery, and set them on the edge of Simone's tray table without making eye contact, and then she walked forward to the galley. Simone sat very still for a moment, looking at the water-damaged materials in front of her, and felt something inside her make a decision. She reached into her jacket pocket, retrieved her phone, and opened the camera application. She began recording quietly, deliberately, with the calm efficiency of someone who had been told by her mother since she was old enough to understand it that documentation is not aggression, it is protection, and that there is nothing more powerful than an accurate record. She angled the phone carefully, keeping it below the sight line of the galley, and began capturing the cabin around her with the methodical patience of someone who understood that what she was documenting might matter later in ways she could not yet fully anticipate. From across the aisle, Eleanor Voss had watched the entire sequence of events from behind her reading glasses. She had not said anything because she was the kind of person who understood the difference between the moment to observe and the moment to act, and this was still the former. But she had seen it all: the skipped service, the extended scrutiny of the boarding pass, the accidental water, the murmured comment, and she had the particular expression of someone running a very quiet and very thorough internal analysis. She glanced at Simone's phone, recognized what the girl was doing, and felt something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the particular recognition that comes when someone younger than you demonstrates a wisdom that most people their age have not yet developed. This child, she thought, was going to be all right. Whatever happened on the rest of this flight, this child was going to be all right. The plane lifted from the runway and climbed through the cloud cover over Chicago, banking east toward Boston, and Simone kept the phone recording and watched the city fall away beneath her, and thought about her mother's voice saying, "Walk in there like you belong, because you do," and held on to that voice like something solid in the particular turbulence, not the mechanical kind that she already understood this flight was going to be. At 32,000 feet, with the seatbelt sign chiming off and the first-class cabin settling into the particular comfortable stillness of people who travel this way regularly, Diane Hartley began the in-flight meal service with the fluid confidence of someone doing something she has done hundreds of times and enjoys the authority it gives her. Simone watched her work the cabin from the slightly removed vantage point that 3A provided the window seat, which gave her a clear sight line down the aisle without being directly in the center of any interaction. She watched Diane approach each row with the warm attentiveness of a genuinely skilled service professional. The small conversational exchanges, the remembered preferences, the way she angled the serving tray to accommodate a passenger who was working on a laptop. The soft laugh she offered when the businessman in 1B made a comment Simone couldn't hear but could identify by its effect. It was genuinely impressive. Actually, the service, when directed at the people Diane had decided deserved it, was excellent. Simone thought about that for a moment, the way competence and prejudice can exist in the same person without either one canceling out the other, and then she refocused on what was happening. Diane reached row 3. She approached from the aisle side with the menu folder, stopping beside Eleanor Voss first, who made her selection with brief, efficient courtesy. Then Diane turned toward Simone, and her manner changed in the way it had been changing since O'Hare, not dramatically. Not in a way that an outside observer who hadn't been paying attention would necessarily catch, but in the way that Simone had been catching all morning. "Do you need help understanding the menu?" Diane asked, and her voice was loud enough to carry to the adjacent rows, carrying with it the implication that this was a reasonable question, rather than an extraordinary one. "I know it can be a little overwhelming your first time up here." Simone looked at her steadily. She was an honor student with perfect SAT scores and 3 university acceptance letters already sitting on her mother's kitchen counter. She had been reading menus since she was 4. She said with perfect evenness, "No, thank you. I can read it fine." She made her selection the chicken option with the wild rice and handed back the menu without further comment, and Diane moved on to the next row. Simone continued recording. The meal service progressed with the elegant choreography of first-class air travel trays. Delivered drinks refreshed the small rituals of hospitality performed with the ease of long practice. Simone watched it advance toward her from the front of the cabin like a tide moving up a shore, reaching each row in turn. And then Diane reached the passenger in 2A, and then the passengers in row 3. the businessman in the aisle seat, whom she served with a warm smile and a remark about the landing time, and then she walked past seat 3A without stopping, without a tray, without a word, continuing on to row 4, as though the window seat simply did not exist. Simone waited. She gave it 4 minutes, long enough to be certain it was not an oversight, and then pressed the call button. Diane appeared promptly, which was its own kind of statement. If she were genuinely overwhelmed with service demands, prompt response would be impossible. She stood at the end of Simone's row with a neutral expression and said, "Yes, I haven't received my meal," Simone said, keeping her voice quiet and her tone entirely free of accusation, because she had learned from her mother that accusations give people an exit, and she was not interested in giving anyone an exit today. "I'm sorry," Diane said in the tone of someone who was not. "We've run out of the chicken option. That's completely fine. I'm happy to take whatever alternative is available." There was a brief pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. "We've actually run out of the first-class meal options entirely," Diane said. "I can bring you something from economy if you'd like." Simone absorbed this information without changing her expression. "That would be fine," she said. "Thank you." She watched Diane walk back toward the galley, and then let her gaze travel very naturally, very casually, to someone who did not know she was looking to the passenger 3 rows ahead, who had received his tray perhaps 8 minutes ago. The chicken option with the wild rice, exactly as Simone had ordered it, sitting on his tray table in the unmistakable serving dish of Horizon's first-class meal service. Simone shifted the phone's angle, capturing the tray 3 rows ahead, and then returned to looking out the window at the flat, cloud-broken Midwest passing 32,000 feet below her. 20 minutes passed. No food arrived from economy or anywhere else. Simone drank her terminal water and reviewed her Harvard prep notes from memory, because the printed versions were still damp and fragile in their sleeves, and she did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what was happening to her, because she needed to stay clear, and she knew from experience that the full weight of things can be felt later after you have done what needs to be done in the moment. She was 17 years old, and she was alone on a plane, and she was being systematically, she would use a different word later, a word her mother preferred for its precision. She was being deliberately excluded from the service she had paid for in a space she had every right to occupy by someone who had decided without asking a single question that she did not belong here. She pressed record again, making sure she had clean footage of the meal service happening around her empty tray table, the full cabin visible, the contrast undeniable. She was not going to let this disappear. She was going to make sure it could be seen exactly as it was. "I don't believe you're fine." The voice came from across the aisle, low and direct and entirely without condescension, and Simone turned to find Eleanor Voss looking at her over the frame of her reading glasses with an expression that was not pity. Simone was instinctively allergic to pity, and Eleanor seemed to understand this, but something more precise, the kind of focused attention that comes from someone who has spent decades assessing situations for what they actually are, rather than what they appear to be. "I'm managing," Simone said, which was true in the limited sense that she was upright and composed and had not done anything that could be used against her. "I'm sure you are," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing." She paused, then said, "My name is Eleanor Voss. I've been sitting across from you since O'Hare, and I have watched every interaction you have had with that woman since you boarded." Another pause. "It's appalling." Simone looked at her for a moment, this precise, silver-haired woman who had not offered her title, just her name, which somehow made the statement more credible rather than less, and felt something inside her give slightly the particular release that comes when someone who does not have to acknowledge something chooses to anyway. "Thank you for noticing," she said. "It would be difficult not to notice," Eleanor replied for anyone who was looking. They sat with that for a moment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, the unspoken understanding of two people who knew that many passengers had been looking and had chosen not to notice, and that this was its own kind of statement about the world. What happened next was Diane Hartley returning to the first-class cabin with a clipboard scanning the rows, with the professional efficiency of someone doing a head count, and then stopping in the center of the aisle, not at any particular row, not directed at any specific passenger, and making an announcement in the carrying practiced voice of a flight attendant delivering information to the entire cabin. Just a reminder that first class is reserved for ticketed first-class passengers only, and companions or guests of passengers should make sure they're in their assigned seats. Nobody was standing. Nobody was out of place. Nobody in the first-class cabin was occupying a seat they hadn't been assigned, and the announcement delivered to the full cabin, as though it were general information, had no logical target except the one person currently seated in first class, whom Diane had been treating all morning, as though her presence there required continuous justification. The cabin processed this in the silence that follows when something has happened that nobody quite knows how to address. Eleanor Voss addressed it. "Excuse me." Her voice was not raised, but it had the quality that courtrooms develop in a person after 30 years the absolute expectation of being heard. She looked at Diane directly. "Your announcement appears to be unnecessary. Every person in this cabin has a valid first-class ticket, including the young woman beside me. Perhaps you could clarify who you were addressing." Diane met Eleanor's gaze with the composure of someone trying to hold a position she could feel shifting under her. "I'm simply following standard reminders, ma'am. Standard reminders are delivered when a situation requires them," Eleanor said. "I'd be interested to hear which situation prompted this one." 2 or 3 heads in the nearby rows had turned now, the kind of attention that gathers quietly in an enclosed space when the social temperature changes, and people sense that something real is happening beneath the surface of what's being said. A middle-aged man in the row behind Simone glanced between Eleanor and Diane with the careful expression of someone who has not yet decided whether to stay neutral. Diane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she recovered her professional smoothness. "We appreciate your understanding," she said, which was not an answer, and turned back toward the galley. Eleanor turned to Simone and said quietly, "Keep your phone recording." "It's already recording," Simone said. Eleanor nodded once with the slow satisfaction of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion that they were confident about, but needed to verify. She returned to her book, but she did not turn a single page for the next 20 minutes, and when the flight attendant's footsteps moved back down the aisle, she watched without appearing to watch the way people do when they have decided to pay attention to something and have enough experience to do it without announcing themselves. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin had reached the settled equilibrium of long-haul air travel passengers absorbed in work or sleep, or the particular suspended state that flights produce, the outside world held at 30,000 feet below the pressures of departure and arrival, temporarily irrelevant. It had the quality of a held breath, that equilibrium, and Simone had learned to recognize that things can shatter very quickly in enclosed spaces when someone decides they want them to. She unbuckled her seatbelt during a smooth stretch, slid her phone into her jacket pocket with the recording still running. She had been running it in 20-minute segments and saving each to the cloud before starting the next. A precaution that her mother would have approved of, and walked toward the first-class lavatory at the front of the cabin. Diane Hartley appeared from the galley entrance the way she had been appearing all morning, with the timing of someone who had been watching and waiting and had chosen this particular moment deliberately. She stepped into the aisle in front of Simone with the specific body language of someone who is not stepping aside, who is in fact doing the opposite of stepping aside, positioning herself as a fact that had to be reckoned with. "Economy restrooms are in the back," she said, and her voice was louder than the situation required, carrying across the 2 nearest rows with the clarity of a statement that wanted to be heard. "I'm in first class," Simone said, keeping her voice steady with the focused effort of someone who has been keeping their voice steady for 2 hours. "This is the closest restroom." "I'm aware of where the restrooms are," Diane said. "What I'm asking you to do is use the appropriate facilities for your section." "My section is first class," Simone said. "Seat 3A." And something in Diane shifted the last of whatever professional restraint she had been applying against the pressure of whatever she felt the final layer of the composure that had been the only thing standing between where they had been all morning and where they were about to be. Her voice climbed, losing the studied neutrality of the previous 2 hours, landing instead with the blunt weight of something that had been looking for an exit and had finally found one. "Know your place," she said, and every person in the surrounding rows heard it. And then, as though that were not sufficient, as though the sentence needed completion, "People like you don't belong in first class." The cabin went silent. Not the polite, managed silence of people pretending not to hear something. The total, stunned, absolute silence of 30 people absorbing a statement that had taken a thing that was previously deniable and made it undeniable out loud in front of witnesses with no ambiguity and no possible alternative interpretation. Simone stood in the aisle and felt the words land the way a physical impact lands, the reverberation of it moving through her before the meaning fully registers. And she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not cry. Not because she did not feel any of those things pressing upward inside her, but because she had her phone in her pocket and it was recording, and she understood in that moment with complete clarity that what had just happened was a gift in the terrible sense that evidence can be a gift, the kind of gift you would have preferred never to need, but are profoundly grateful to have. The man in the row behind her said audibly, "Did she just say that?" From 3B. Eleanor Voss had risen from her seat. She did not move into the aisle, but she was standing, and her presence standing was itself a statement. A retired federal judge in a first-class cabin getting to her feet after what she had just heard was not a neutral act. "That's enough," she said with the particular authority of someone who has spent 3 decades meaning it. Diane turned toward her, and whatever she might have said was interrupted by the arrival of Derek Cole, the broad-shouldered lead flight attendant who had apparently been alerted by the change in cabin tone and emerged from the forward galley with the practiced urgency of someone whose job includes managing exactly this kind of situation. He was blond, square-jawed, with the specific physical confidence of someone accustomed to his authority being accepted, and his gaze moved to Simone before it moved to Diane, which told Simone everything she needed to know about whose account he had already decided to believe. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his tone professionally neutral but aimed past Simone toward his colleague. "This passenger has been non-compliant and disruptive throughout the flight," Diane said, her composure reassembling itself around Derek's arrival like a wound closing. "I was attempting to redirect her to appropriate facilities when she became confrontational." "That is not what happened," Simone said. Her voice was completely level. "She has refused me service, deliberately damaged my documents, and just told me in front of this entire cabin that people like me don't belong in first class. I have been recording since the water incident." Derek's expression did not change, which was its own response. "Miss, I understand you're upset, but Diane is one of our most senior crew members, and I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding about—" "There was no misunderstanding," said Eleanor Voss, still standing in 3B with the patient certainty of someone who does not need to raise her voice to be heard. "I have been sitting across from this young woman since O'Hare. I have witnessed every interaction. There was no misunderstanding." Derek's jaw moved slightly. He looked at Eleanor, reassessed something about the way she was standing, and made a decision. "I'd like to speak with the passenger privately," he said, gesturing toward the galley in the manner of an invitation that was not actually optional. In the galley away from the direct sight lines of most passengers, but not Simone, noted this carefully out of earshot of the closest rows. Derek's tone dropped from professional neutrality into something that had an edge to it. The low register weight of someone who was not asking, but was structuring a conversation as though he were. "You need to understand something," he said. "Making accusations against crew members is serious. Recording staff without consent is against airline policy and potentially a federal matter. If you have recordings on your phone, I'm strongly advising you to delete them and return to your seat." Simone looked at him and said nothing, which was itself an answer. Derek leaned in slightly, using the height differential in the specific way that people use height differentials when they want to communicate something they can't say directly. "I'm trying to help you here," he said. "This flight still has an hour and a half. It would be much better for everyone if we just settled this quietly." And then from the forward galley, Diane said something to another crew member in the tone of voice people use when they think they are not being overheard in a space that is smaller than they are accounting for. Something about a Thanksgiving dinner, and not letting her, the word unmistakable in context, ruin the flight. Derek's head turned fractionally, and he said sharply, "Diane?" Simone had caught it all. She had been close enough, and the galley acoustics had carried it, and her recording had been running. She returned to her seat without another word. Her face composed her phone, still recording a piece of information sitting in her chest like something warm. Not a victory, not yet, but the particular feeling of evidence of having something solid in your hands that cannot be taken away from you. She did not yet know about the shared last name. She did not yet know about the uncle. But she knew what she had heard, and she knew what it meant, and she began composing in the methodical back portion of her mind, where she kept the things that mattered, the message she would send her mother when she had service again. The man in the row behind Simone had been watching with the careful neutrality of someone who was certain of what he was seeing but waiting for the right moment to confirm it. And when Diane returned to the cabin after Derek's reprimand and the passengers around Simone had settled back into the managed quiet of people who had witnessed something and were still processing it, he leaned slightly forward and said very quietly in Simone's direction, "James Park." Simone turned. He was Korean-American, mid-40s, with the particular attentive stillness of someone who spends a lot of time in rooms where what is said and what is meant are two different things. He was holding a business card between two fingers, in the discreet way that people sometimes pass things in situations where discretion is appropriate, and Simone took it without looking at it, keeping her hand below the seat back. "Civil rights attorney," he said, still at the volume of a private conversation. "I've also been recording since the announcement." Simone looked at him for one full second, and then nodded once and turned back to face forward. Eleanor Voss, who had returned to her seat but was monitoring the aisle with the peripheral attention of someone who had not actually stood down, caught the exchange and produced a small notebook from her bag. The kind of small leather-bound notebook that suggests a person has been carrying one for decades, and a pen. She passed both across the aisle to Simone without comment. The three of them exchanged information in the unhurried, unremarkable manner of passengers sharing travel recommendations, which is what it would have appeared to be from any distance, Eleanor writing something in the notebook and handing it back. Simone writing and returning it, James accepting it over the seat back for a moment and adding his information. Within 4 minutes, they had a complete exchange of contact details and a shared understanding of what each of them had seen and documented. James leaned forward once more, close enough to be heard without projecting. They're going to flip the narrative before landing. Their goal now is to make you the problem passenger, disruptive, uncooperative, possibly threatening. It's the move that protects them and discredits you. They need their version of events to be the one law enforcement hears first. Simone absorbed this without visible reaction because she had grown up listening to her mother describe exactly this playbook across dozens of cases, the way institutions protect themselves by reframing the victim of their behavior as the source of the disruption. As if confirming James's read precisely on schedule, Derek's voice came over the intercom in the flat, carefully modulated tone of someone delivering information that is designed to generate a particular interpretation in its listeners. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. We are experiencing some passenger management issues that may require attention upon landing. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." The words passenger management issues landed in the cabin with the deliberate weight of an implication rather than a fact. No specifics, but enough to direct the attention of every passenger who had not been watching toward the question of which passenger, and enough ambiguity that the answer could be constructed from suggestion rather than evidence. Simone felt the subtle social shift around her 2 or 3 rows of passengers who had not witnessed anything now oriented toward the idea that something was wrong and the nearest available candidate for what was wrong sitting in 3A. She opened her phone. The backup was still uploading. She checked the progress, confirmed it, and then composed her message to her mother. Methodical. Precise the way her mother had taught her to report things that mattered. The flight number, the departure and arrival airports, the names from the name tags she had read carefully throughout the morning, a summary of what had happened and what had been said, the arrival time, the gate number. Then she set the phone face down on her tray table and looked out the window at the cloud cover above New England and breathed slowly and carefully, the way you breathe when you have done what you can do, and the next part has not yet arrived. Doctor. Renee Carter read her daughter's text message in the back of a government car outside a federal building in Washington, D.C., and her response was the kind of response that had been honed by 20 years of understanding exactly how quickly situations like this one can be lost if they are not responded to with precision in the first hour. She called the Horizon Airlines corporate number from memory. She had dealt with the airline's legal team twice in the previous 3 years on unrelated matters and asked to be connected to the senior leadership on duty. A man named Harold Keating, Chief Operating Officer, answered with the practiced cordiality of someone accustomed to managing calls that arrived through the executive line unannounced, and Dr. Carter explained the situation on her daughter's flight with the composed clarity of someone who had described discrimination incidents to corporate executives many times and understood exactly what kind of language landed. Keating's concern on the telephone was comprehensive and appropriately alarmed. He thanked her for calling. He assured her this was being looked into immediately. He hung up and called Diane Hartley on the crew phone. Brenda's her aunt. He told the person who answered after the second ring using Diane's personal nickname within the family, which told Simone when she later heard the full account something about the nature of the relationship between the Keating and Hartley families that was more informative than any official organizational chart. What's happening on that flight? The conversation that followed, reconstructed later through several sources, lasted 8 minutes and resulted in a set of instructions that Diane received with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with her uncle's crisis management before and understood the protocol document. Everything against the passenger, build the counter-narrative while the plane is still in the air, and do not give the girl anything that can be used against them. Back in seat 3. Simone did not know any of this yet. She knew her mother had responded, "Stay calm. Keep recording. I'll contact corporate. What's your arrival time?" And she knew from the tone of the response, which was 3 sentences and a question, rather than reassurance, that her mother had understood immediately that this was serious and had begun moving. Diane appeared in the aisle 30 minutes before landing. She was carrying a tray with red wine for the passengers across the aisle and in the row ahead, and her approach from behind Simone was the approach of someone who had done the calculation about angles and timing, and what happened was that the tray tilted with the same practiced inexactness as the water pitcher earlier. Not a spill, exactly, not the accident that a real spill would be, but a directed tipping a glass that came off the tray at an angle that physics suggested was not entirely unintentional, and the red wine went across Simone's lap and up the front of her blazer and onto the white blouse underneath in a spread that covered the entire interview outfit she had pressed with care the night before, the one her mother had upgraded her seat to make special, the one she had planned to walk into Harvard wearing tomorrow morning. The silence that followed the spill had a different quality than the silence after Diane's words in the aisle, which had been the silence of shock. This was the silence of something being recognized, the pattern made undeniable by its repetition, the accident that wasn't the second ruination of Simone's belongings in a single flight, and every person in the nearby rows who had been paying attention understood what they were watching. "How clumsy of me," Diane said with the specific insincerity that is worse than no apology because it announces itself. "And on your interview clothes, too. What a shame." Eleanor Voss was already in motion. "Come with me," she said to Simone, standing and gesturing toward the lavatory. "We'll see what we can save." In the small mirrored space of the first-class lavatory with the door closed and the noise of the cabin reduced to a muffled hum, Eleanor pressed paper towels against the stain with the focused practicality of someone who was doing what could be done while simultaneously saying what needed to be said. "Take photos of the damage before we work on it," she said. "Date-stamped photos. Document this the same way you've documented everything else." Simone took the photos. The blazer was beyond saving. The blouse had a chance if they worked quickly, which Eleanor did with the calm efficiency of someone who had once managed a courtroom and understood that controlled action in a difficult situation is the only productive response to it. "She's building a case against you," Eleanor said while they worked. "That's what the announcement was, and that's what this is. She wants documentation on her side before you can document on yours. Don't let her get ahead of you." When they returned to their seats, James Park leaned forward and said in the same quiet register he had used before property damage, "That strengthens everything. Don't lose the blazer." In the forward galley, Derek was standing beside a man in 5C, a businessman who had been wearing noise-canceling headphones for most of the flight and had missed the events in the aisle and was conducting a conversation in the tones of someone taking an official record. He was asking whether the man had noticed the passenger in 3A displaying any concerning behavior, whether she had seemed agitated, whether he had witnessed her consuming anything from her bag. The man in 5C, confused but deferential to the uniform, was nodding in ways that could be shaped into a statement. Simone's email notification arrived 11 minutes before landing Horizon Airlines with the subject line, "Reservation Update," informing her that her return ticket had been canceled for safety-related reasons per crew discretion, non-negotiable. Then the captain's intercom with the measured voice of authority and the deliberate vagueness of something that had been phrased to create a specific impression. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been made aware of a situation in the cabin that may require us to make arrangements upon landing. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The passengers who had witnessed everything recognized what was happening. The passengers who hadn't, a significant portion of the cabin people who had been asleep or absorbed in work or simply not looking in the right direction, heard the announcement and looked around. And the nearest available answer to the question it generated was still sitting quietly in 3A, her wine-stained blazer folded on her lap, her face composed, her phone still running. Simone looked out the window. Boston was below them now, the harbor visible, the city grid emerging through the afternoon light. Somewhere in that city was Harvard University, where she was supposed to be tomorrow morning, and she thought about her mother's voice on the phone in about 40 minutes, and she thought about the recording that was safely in the cloud, and she let herself feel very briefly and very privately the full weight of what had been done to her on this flight. Not just the service and the wine and the words, but the specific sustained effort to make her feel that she was wrong to be here, that she did not belong in the space she had paid for, and earned, that her presence in a first-class seat was something that needed to be continuously justified and could at any moment be revoked. She let herself feel it, and then she put it away the way her mother had taught her to put things away when there was still work to be done. The wheels touched down at Logan International at 3:47 p.m. Through the oval of her window seat, Simone saw them before the plane had finished taxiing to the gate. 2 airport police vehicles parked on the tarmac beside the assigned jet bridge. Blue lights rotating in the gray Boston afternoon, with the particular visual language of authority being deployed, which is designed to communicate that something serious has already been decided before anyone has spoken to you. Eleanor Voss said, without looking away from her book, in a low and steady voice, "They are trying to make you afraid so that you do something that justifies what they've already told authorities about you. Do not give them anything." James Park leaned forward. Don't answer questions without me physically beside you. You say that you want your attorney present. Those exact words. Nothing else. Simone nodded without turning her head. She was already doing the deep, deliberate breathing, the pre-debate breathing, and sorting through what she had and what she needed and what the next 30 minutes required from her. Derek made one final cabin announcement. The voice of practiced authority delivering what sounded like information and functioned as a frame. Ladies and gentlemen, when we arrive at the gate, please remain seated until our crew has addressed a brief security situation. We appreciate your patience. A brief security situation. In the rows where passengers had not witnessed the prior 5 hours, Simone could feel the attention orienting toward her as the most visible anomaly in the cabin. The girl with the wine-stained blazer. The girl who had been the subject of announcements. The girl who was now apparently a security situation, and she kept her face still and her hands folded, and thought about what her mother always said. The story people hear first is the story they believe, which is why you have to tell yours accurately and completely and with evidence attached. She had the evidence. It was in the cloud. Nothing that happened in the next 30 minutes could touch it. When the cabin door opened, Derek approached her row with the official weight of someone executing a procedure rather than having a conversation. Miss, the authorities need to speak with you first. Please bring all your belongings. Simone gathered her carry-on and her ruined portfolio, and the blazer folded over her arm, and walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin toward the door with her head up and her pace measured. She was aware of every eye in the cabin. She did not rush, and she did not slow, and she did not look at Diane Hartley, who was standing near the galley, because Diane Hartley had gotten everything from her that she was going to get. The jet bridge smelled of jet fuel and cold air. 2 uniformed airport officers were waiting their expressions, the specific neutral of people who have been briefed and are waiting to see if the briefing matches what they encounter. Derek announced with professional concern, "This is the passenger in question. She's been combative and disruptive throughout the flight, refusing crew instructions and making threatening statements toward staff." "That's false," Simone said clearly and without anger. "I have been the target of racial discrimination by this crew since boarding. I have recordings on my phone and in cloud backup documenting every incident, including verbal statements made directly to me about my race." She also admitted to unauthorized recording of crew members, Derek added, which is against federal regulations. The officers exchanged a glance. "Miss, we need you to come with us to the security office. We'll sort this out there." The security office was a beige room with fluorescent lights and a table and chairs that communicated function rather than comfort, and it filled up in stages that Simone tracked carefully. Keating arrived first, well-dressed smooth, introducing himself with the automatic authority of someone who has walked into rooms like this with corporate cover for his entire career and expects it to work. Then Diane, who had the particular composure of someone who believes they are about to win, standing near the door with her arms loosely folded. Diane's voice was almost casual when she addressed the officers. "You might want to check her bag." She said it in the tone of a suggestion rather than an accusation, which was the more insidious version of an accusation because it implied that the thought had arrived independently and reasonably. She appeared to be drinking during the flight, given her age. One officer unzipped Simone's backpack, and there, tucked into the outer pocket, alongside her phone charger, were 2 miniature liquor bottles. Simone had never seen them before in her life. "Those are not mine," she said, and her voice was steady, but she felt the blood drain slightly from her face at the sheer audacity of it. The planning that this required, the moment during the wine spill when Diane had been close enough to her bag, the deliberateness of it. "Someone put those in my bag. I don't drink. I've never bought a miniature bottle of anything. Check the security footage from O'Hare. My bag went through screening and there was nothing in that pocket." Diane smiled thinly. The crew observed her behavior throughout the flight. "That is a fabrication. said Eleanor Voss from the doorway. The room turned. Eleanor stepped inside, and James Park stepped in beside her, and Eleanor said, "I am Eleanor Voss, retired federal judge, 6th Circuit. I sat across from this young woman for the duration of this flight. I witnessed every interaction. She consumed nothing except water she brought from the terminal. The flight attendant who is standing in this room deliberately skipped her meal service, made discriminatory announcements directed solely at her, physically blocked her access to the first-class lavatory, and told her loudly in front of a full cabin that people like you don't belong in first class. I am prepared to provide a full sworn statement to that effect." James Park said James Park, civil rights attorney, also a witness, also recording. The oxygen in the room shifted. Keating's composure held, but it held the way a wall holds when it has developed a crack, still standing but visibly working at it. He began his corporate damage control language, passenger misconduct crew, safety standard procedures, but the words had lost the solidity that a room without a federal judge and a civil rights attorney would have given them. The door opened one more time. Dr. Renee Carter walked in. She was in a tailored suit, her DOJ credentials already in her hand, not displayed with theater, but simply present as a fact, and she said her name and her title in the same tone she used for everything, even precise, carrying the weight of 20 years in courtrooms and conference rooms where she had been the most prepared person in the space. Harold Keating recognized the name. Simone watched his face in the moment of recognition and thought, "There it is. There is the moment everything changes." Not because her mother had arrived, but because Keating now understood for the first time with the full specific clarity of a man calculating consequences what he had set in motion against a 17-year-old girl on a Tuesday afternoon flight to Boston, and what it was going to cost him. The quality of silence in a room changes when the balance of power in it changes, and Simone, who had been sitting in rooms for her entire life trying to read the difference between the silence that precedes someone being heard and the silence that precedes someone being dismissed, recognized immediately which kind this was. It was the former. For the first time since O'Hare, it was the former. Dr. Carter did not look at Simone first. She looked at the officers with the measured attention of someone establishing the relevant facts before addressing the relevant people and said, "Can someone explain on what grounds my daughter is being detained?" The senior officer, a man in his 50s who had been doing his job long enough to recognize when a situation had exceeded its initial parameters, cleared his throat and said, "We've received a report of disruptive passenger behavior during the flight, ma'am. We're still in the process of—" "My daughter's recordings are already in cloud storage," Dr. Carter said. "They have been backed up off device since shortly after the incidents began. If anyone in this room has considered or attempted to confiscate her phone with the intent of deleting evidence, I'd encourage them to reconsider that plan very carefully." Keating said, "Dr. Carter, I appreciate your concern as a parent, but this is an internal airline matter involving documented passenger conduct issues. Racial discrimination by a federally regulated air carrier is not an internal matter," Dr. Carter said, and she did not raise her voice, which was more effective than raising it would have been. "It is a federal civil rights matter, which is, as it happens, precisely the area of law I have spent 20 years working in." She looked at him for a moment in the way that people look at each other when they are communicating something that the room is not meant to hear directly, and Keating absorbed it with the expression of a man who has just been shown a hand he did not know existed, and is calculating how much it changes the game. Simone, sitting at the table with her ruined blazer on her lap, took this moment, while the attention in the room was on her mother and Keating, to open her phone, navigate to her cloud storage, and confirm that all 7 recording segments were present, time-stamped, and accessible. 43 minutes of audio and video from Horizon Airlines Flight 247. Clean, continuous, authenticated. She closed the app and set the phone face down on the table. Eleanor Voss was already in the process of giving her formal statement to the second officer, speaking in the precise, measured cadence of someone who understands that every word she says is going to be written down and that precision is therefore not optional. She described each incident in chronological order, The boarding pass examination, the skipped pre-departure beverage, the water spill the document, damage the menu, comment, the skipped meal service, the announcement, the aisle confrontation, the words said in the aisle, the wine and the liquor bottles that had appeared in Simone's bag, in circumstances that any investigator would find worth examining closely. James Park was on his phone in the corner of the room, speaking quietly to someone a colleague Simone would learn later who was already pulling Horizon's discrimination complaint history for the past 5 years. Diane Hartley had stopped speaking. She was standing near the door with the particular stillness of someone who has realized that the room has reorganized around them in a way they did not anticipate, that the audience they expected is no longer the audience they have, and that the things they said with confidence 20 minutes ago are now lying in the open in a way that was not the plan. Derek Cole was staring at the table. Keating made one more attempt with the professional tenacity of someone who has survived other difficult rooms by not giving ground. We have multiple witness accounts of disruptive behavior. We have evidence of underage consumption of alcohol. We have... The security footage from O'Hare will show exactly what was in my daughter's bag when it cleared screening this morning, Dr. Carter said. If it shows what I believe it shows, which is that the bag was clean, which means those bottles were placed there during the flight by someone with access to the bag, then what we are discussing is no longer a discrimination complaint. What we are discussing is the deliberate planting of evidence on a minor, which is a criminal matter. She paused. I would encourage everyone in this room to think carefully about what category of situation they would like to be in. The senior officer had stopped writing and was looking at Keating with the specific expression of someone who has just recalculated which side of the line they are on and is making adjustments. Doctor, Carter crossed the room and sat beside her daughter, and for a moment she simply looked at Simone, at the wine-stained blouse, the damaged portfolio on the table, the steady, dry eyes of her child who had been through 5 hours of deliberate persecution and was still sitting upright with her back straight, and something passed across her face that was not professional, that had nothing to do with the Justice Department or civil rights law or the strategic calculation of what came next. Simone said quietly, I got everything. Every word. It's all in the cloud. Dr. Carter nodded once. She put her hand over Simone's on the table and pressed once briefly, and then withdrew it and turned back to the room. My daughter has an interview at Harvard University tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she said, addressing the senior officer. I would like to know what is needed from her tonight and when she is free to go to her hotel. The officer looked at the documentation in front of him. Eleanor Voss's statement, James Park's business card, the airport screening records that a second officer had pulled up on a tablet, and then at Harold Keating, and then at Diane Hartley. And then he said, I don't see any basis for detaining Miss Carter further. She's free to go. Keating said nothing. Diane Hartley stared at the wall. Simone stood up, picked up her ruined blazer, and followed her mother out of the room, and she did not look back because looking back was not something she was interested in doing. The hotel room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after sustained noise and pressure, the particular quality of silence that arrives when you close a door behind you and the outside world does not immediately follow. Doctor. Carter set her bag down on the desk, and Simone sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation, the shared acknowledgement that something had happened that required a moment before it required words. Then Simone opened her phone, found the first recording segment, and pressed play. Dr. Carter stood and listened to 43 minutes of audio and video evidence from Horizon Airlines Flight 247 without sitting down. She listened to the menu comment. She listened to the skipped service captured in the ambient sound of trays being distributed to the rows around 3A and the absence of any tray arriving at 3A itself. She listened to Diane Hartley's announcement about first class being for ticketed passengers delivered to a cabin where every passenger was in their ticketed seat. She listened to the aisle confrontation, which was crisp and clear and entirely without ambiguity. The exchange, the escalation, the words themselves caught with the precision of a phone positioned by someone who had understood what she was doing and had done it right. When the recording reached those 9 words, "People like you don't belong in first class," Dr. Carter's expression did not change, but something behind it did in the specific particular way that a parent's face changes when they hear confirmation of something they had understood intellectually but now understand in their body. When all 7 segments had played, she sat down. The silence lasted about 15 seconds, which was long enough for both of them to feel the full weight of what the recordings contained before they talked about what to do with it. "You did everything right," Dr. Carter said. "Finally. Every single thing." "I know," Simone said. It was not arrogance. It was the statement of a person who had done something deliberately under pressure in circumstances designed to make them make a mistake and had not made a mistake. Her mother nodded, accepting this as the fact it was. Dr. Carter made 3 calls in the next 30 minutes. The first was to Lena Hadley, an investigative journalist with a Pulitzer and a 20-year record of holding corporations to account, who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting for 4 minutes and said, "I've been waiting for a case that could crack Horizon open. Send me what you have." The second was to Caroline Marsh, one of the top civil rights litigators in the country, who had worked with Dr. Carter on 2 landmark cases in the previous decade, and whose response to the summary was a 5-second pause, followed by, "I'm on a plane tomorrow morning. Boston Wright." The third call was brief to a number that Simone did not recognize, and her mother stepped into the bathroom for it and kept her voice low, and when she came out she said only, "That will matter later," in the tone she used when she was managing multiple threads of a situation, and not all of them were ready to be explained. James Park, meanwhile, had been doing the work he had said he would do. He arrived at the hotel 40 minutes after them with a laptop and the particular focused energy of someone who had been running case analysis since the security office. His initial research had surfaced 24 separate discrimination complaints against Horizon Airlines filed in the past 3 years, nearly all involving passengers of color in premium cabins. Nearly all resolved quietly with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the individuals from speaking publicly, each case isolated from the others by the legal architecture of those agreements in a way that made the individual incidents look like exceptions, rather than what they actually were when placed side by side, a pattern. Eleanor Voss arrived at the hotel shortly after James, having declined Horizon's standard passenger assistance offering with the particular crispness of someone who found the gesture insufficient in the context of what had just occurred. She sat in the desk chair and gave her formal account one more time in full for the record that Caroline Marsh's associate was already building. A former Horizon HR employee called James's personal number at 9:15 in the evening, having found it through a mutual contact. She had been dismissed from the airline 6 months earlier, after raising concerns internally about what she called the airline's passenger profiling practices, and she spoke for 20 minutes in the nervous but resolute voice of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. The internal language, she explained, was premium cabin culture preservation, a phrase that appeared in training documentation and internal communications and meant in practice that flight crew were being trained through coded instruction to monitor and discourage passengers who did not match the imagined profile of a first-class traveler. It was not a rogue flight attendant. It was a written practice dressed in language designed to be deniable. Lena Hadley, who had arrived at the hotel at 10 with a digital forensics expert in tow, said, "That's not a policy. That's a liability." The forensics expert spent an hour creating authenticated time-stamped backups of all of Simone's recordings on secured external storage with an unbroken chain of custody, and confirmed that Massachusetts' one-party consent law meant every recording was entirely legal. Simone sat at the desk and wrote out the full timeline of the flight in a document that was precise and chronological, and used the same language she had been trained to use in debate factual, clear avoiding both understatement and exaggeration, because she knew this document was going to be read by people who had not been there, and she needed it to be something that stood on its own. At 11:30, Simone's phone received a text from an unknown number. She looked at it once, showed it to her mother, and watched Dr. Carter's expression move through something before returning to still. The text described the silver Honda that Judge Voss's daughter had lent them the hotel parking garage's third floor, the specific space they had parked in. It ended with a sentence that functioned as a threat by describing an option and calling it a suggestion. Dr. Carter said, "From this moment, no electronic devices for logistics, no credit cards, no full names used in any public space." She looked around the room at Eleanor James, Lena, the forensics expert, and then at her daughter. "They're trying to tell us they can reach us anywhere. What they are actually telling us is that they are afraid." She paused. "They should be." Simone, sitting at the desk with her timeline document open and her Harvard prep notes spread beside it, reconstructed from memory because the originals were damaged, looked at her mother in the specific way she sometimes looked at her when she understood something in a new way, something she had known abstractly but now felt concretely. "I still want to make my interview," she said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. There were at least 6 logistical reasons why the interview could be rescheduled, and the admissions office would understand, and nobody would blame her for what had happened today. Dr. Carter said, "Then let's make sure you're ready." By midnight, the presidential suite had become the kind of room that Simone associated with her mother's stories about the early days of her career. Long tables covered in documents, phones in constant rotation, multiple conversations running in parallel. The particular focused intensity of people who understand that the next few hours matter for reasons that extend far beyond the immediate situation. Lena Hadley sat at the main table with 2 laptops open and a third charging on the floor beside her, pulling threads from Horizon's publicly available legal records with the systematic efficiency of someone who had learned to build cases from what corporations could not quite manage to hide. 24 discrimination complaints, all settled with ND. As all involving premium cabin passengers of color, individually meaningless in the way that corporations structure settlements to be meaningless collectively, forming a picture that was impossible to misread. She cross-referenced flight attendant names across the complaints and found Diane Hartley's name in 2 previous incidents, both resolved without public record. Carolyn Marsh had joined by secure video call from Washington, reviewing the evidence chain that James Park had been building since the security office, asking sharp questions in the rapid cadence of someone who litigates for a living and knows exactly which questions matter. "The planted bottles are the strongest piece," she said. "If the O'Hare security footage shows a clean bag, and it will because that's what happened, you have the crew deliberately placing evidence on a minor to support a false narrative. That transforms the discrimination case into something the criminal statutes also address." James confirmed that he was already requesting the security footage through official channels with Eleanor Voss's attorney contact at the airport authority, ensuring the request was handled with appropriate urgency. The former HR employee, whose name Simone was not told at the woman's request, which was a precaution Simone respected, had agreed to provide a formal statement through James's office the following morning. Her documentation of the premium cabin culture preservation training language included internal emails that used phrases careful enough to avoid the specific words that trigger immediate legal exposure, while communicating the intent of those words with complete clarity to anyone reading them in the context of what had happened on Flight 247. "This is 20 years of practice," Dr. Carter said, reviewing the internal email language at 2 a.m. with her reading glasses on and a cup of coffee she had not yet drunk going cold beside her laptop. "They've spent 20 years learning how to run this policy without writing it in a way that someone can put in front of a jury. One case and it's a settlement. One employee and it's a termination." But here she set the emails beside James's compilation of the 24 complaints. Here it stops being about one flight attendant who had a bad day. Simone, who was at the smaller desk, working simultaneously on her Harvard prep and the full timeline document, looked up at this. What does it become? Her mother looked at her over the glasses. Evidence of an institution that chose repeatedly over many years to treat certain passengers as less deserving of the service they paid for based solely on what they looked like, and then chose to silence the people who tried to say so. A pause. That's what we're going to show people. Simone went back to her Harvard prep, and her mother went back to the emails, and the suite hummed with the focused energy of people who had found solid ground in a difficult situation and were building on it carefully. 2 more former Horizon employees had contacted James by midnight, one through Lena's secure tip line, one through a civil rights network that had been quietly monitoring the early social media activity around the flight, and both had pieces of a picture that was becoming with each additional piece less deniable. Written guidelines. Training language. Management approval chains. Congresswoman Denise Harlow, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, called Dr. Carter at 12:45, which was not a casual hour for a congressional phone call, and communicated the seriousness with which she had received the information. She had been looking, she said, for a case strong enough to anchor a formal hearing on airline discrimination practices. She had found other cases individually insufficient settlements with NDAs made them difficult to build around publicly, but the combination of a documented incident, authenticated recordings, a federal judge as a witness, and an HR whistleblower describing written policy gave her something she could work with at a scale that individual cases hadn't provided. I'll announce the hearing at the end of the week, she said, but you handle your daughter's interview first. Make sure she goes. Simone, who had been within earshot of this call, met her mother's eyes across the room. I'm going, she said. At approximately the same time, Simone was reconstructing her Harvard interview prep notes from memory in the Boston Harbor Hotel. Harold Keating was on the phone with Horizon's VP of Communications from a car outside the airport, and the conversation had the clipped urgency of someone who has determined that the next 2 hours will determine whether the next 2 years are survivable. The PR statement went out within 30 minutes, crafted with the specific artistry of corporate crisis management. No specifics, no names, no acknowledgement of any particular event, just the vocabulary of institutional concern. Passenger safety, dedicated crew, zero tolerance for disruption, diverse and committed team. It was a statement that functioned by implication rather than fact, suggesting a dangerous passenger without saying so, creating the negative space where the assumption could be planted by the reader who had been primed to look for it. Horizon's digital response team was already monitoring the early social media activity. A few passengers from the flight had already posted vague, impressionistic accounts that lacked the specificity to go viral, but were establishing a narrative trail that Keating needed to get ahead of. His team deployed the influencer network 3 travel personalities with business relationships with Horizon, who posted within 40 minutes of each other with the particular careful phrasing that allows plausible deniability. Always 2 sides to every story. Let's wait for the facts. In my experience with this airline, they treat everyone with respect. Content that was not provably coordinated, but had the timing and tone of coordination. Then Keating's corporate intelligence team compiled the dossier on Simone Carter. Social media accounts clean, consistent, the careful public presence of a teenager raised by a civil rights attorney. Academic records, publicly visible honors debate championships, the community food access program that had been written about twice in local Chicago press. The dossier found nothing that could be reframed as instability or dishonesty. A researcher noted this to Keating with the specific phrasing of someone delivering bad news carefully, and Keating said, "Use the interview. Use Harvard. Find someone in their development office." The call to Harvard's development office was made by a senior vice president rather than Keating himself, which provided one layer of removal, and it was phrased with the careful indirection of corporate communication at its most practiced, nothing direct. Nothing that could be quoted, just a courtesy. Heads up to a development officer with close ties to Horizon's institutional giving about concerns regarding an applicant whose behavior may not reflect the university's values. No specifics named. The implication sufficient. The seed planted in the soil of an institutional relationship that Horizon had cultivated over years precisely for moments when they needed a favor that was too small to be refused and too harmful to be acknowledged. Doctor, Carter received the call from her Justice Department supervisor at 1 a.m. 3 congressional committees had raised concerns. The White House counsel's office was asking questions. There was language being used. Conflict of interest. Personal vendetta. Improper use of position that had the precise fingerprint of language that had been fed into the system from outside by someone who understood how institutional pressure works and wanted it directed at the person most capable of causing them damage. Her supervisor's voice carried genuine regret over the phone. He was not part of this. He was being used as a conduit for it, which was worse in some ways because it meant she could not be angry at him. Administrative leave pending review, he said. Effective immediately. I'm sorry, Nia. After she hung up, Doctor, Carter stood at the hotel window for a moment with the city lights of Boston spread below her and let herself feel the full weight of what was being done. Not to the case, not to the strategy, but to her personally, the deliberate, targeted dismantling of the professional standing she had built with 20 years of exact and careful work, being used as leverage to silence her daughter. She turned away from the window. They've put me on leave, she said to the room. Lena Hadley looked up. James Park stopped typing. Eleanor Voss set down her tea. Which means they're more afraid than I thought. A pause. Good. Simone from the small desk did not look up from her Harvard prep. She had heard. She was processing it in the particular way she processed things that were designed to break her resolve, acknowledging the weight of them setting them down, continuing. Mom, she said, yes, if we take the settlement they offered and sign the NDA, what happens to the next person on the next flight? Dr. Carter looked at her daughter. Nothing, she said. Nothing changes for them. Simone nodded and went back to her notes. Dr. Carter went back to her laptop. The room continued its work. The threats did not stop at professional pressure. The Carter family's mortgage lender, Metropolitan Bank, which held a note on their Chicago condo that had been refinanced at favorable terms 3 years ago through a financial relationship that Horizon's institutional partners now had leverage over, received a quiet briefing about the situation that resulted in a notice of interest rate review delivered to Dr. Carter's personal email at 2 a.m, which was not a coincidence and was not intended to appear as one. Their apartment in Chicago, they would discover when they returned, had been entered while they were in Boston, nothing taken. Nothing obviously disturbed, but the small telltale signs of careful examination. A stack of mail rearranged a picture frame at a fractionally different angle than the precise position Dr. Carter had maintained for 3 years. A faint, unfamiliar scent in the air of the home office. A message that arrived in the vocabulary of presence rather than words we can reach you anywhere. They're trying to isolate us, Dr. Carter explained to Simone in the taxi from Logan after the private plane had returned them to Chicago and the apartment had been checked. Make us feel watched, surrounded alone until the settlement feels like relief rather than defeat. It's the same playbook they used on every one of those 24 people before us. She took her daughter's hand. Those 24 people didn't have what we have. What do we have? Simone asked. Evidence, Dr. Carter said. Eleanor, James, Lena, and the fact that we already know exactly what they're doing. She paused. And each other, she added. That too. The morning of Simone's Harvard interview was clear and cold. Boston's skyline sharp against a winter blue sky that had the quality of something cleaned. and Simone stood in the hotel room at 7:15 in the emergency replacement outfit her mother had bought from a shop 2 blocks away the previous evening, a charcoal gray blazer over a cream blouse. Not her first choice, not the outfit she had pressed and planned for, but professional and composed and hers. "How do I look?" she asked. Her mother looked at her for a moment with the expression she sometimes had that was not quite neutral and not quite emotional, the expression of someone holding both things at once. "Like someone who knows what she's worth," she said. Kevin Park's security assessment had determined that using transportation apps was inadvisable. Horizon's response team had demonstrated the scope of their surveillance capabilities, and a predictable travel pattern was a vulnerability. Eleanor Voss had made a call the previous evening, and her daughter's car, a plain dark sedan registered to no name associated with either the Brooks or Voss families, was waiting outside. Eleanor herself insisted on driving. "They'll be looking for a mother and daughter," she said, settling into the driver's seat with the unhurried competence of someone who had once navigated far more complicated situations than morning Boston traffic. "They won't be looking for an elderly white woman driving a student to campus." Simone sat in the passenger seat with her reconstructed interview notes on her lap, and the particular focused stillness she brought to the minutes before a debate round when the preparation was complete, and the work was to be present rather than to continue preparing. She had been through the material enough times now that she knew it not as notes but as understanding the food access program, its expansion from 1 pickup point to 6. The family served the gaps. It addressed the questions she anticipated and the answers that were not performances but simply true. The news vans were at Harvard's main entrance. Someone had leaked the interview schedule, the timing too precise for coincidence, and the cameras were positioned to catch either Simone arriving or Simone hiding from arriving, both of which would have served Horizon's counter-narrative in different ways. Eleanor pulled to the side entrance without discussion. A woman was waiting there. Angela Way, Associate Director of Admissions, who had called Dr. Carter that morning to say she had arranged a quiet waiting space and to confirm that the interview was proceeding as scheduled. "Miss Carter," she said, meeting Simone in the quiet hallway, "I want you to know that what we heard about what happened to you yesterday had no effect on how your application is being considered. You earned your interview entirely on your own record." "Thank you," Simone said. She meant it without needing to perform it. The interview room was a small, warmly lit office with books on the shelves and 2 chairs arranged at an angle that suggested conversation rather than examination. Professor Reyes was a man in his mid-50s with the particular attentiveness of an academic who finds people more interesting than they expect him to. And he shook Simone's hand with the straightforward warmth of someone who had read her application and was genuinely interested in the person behind it. The next 45 minutes moved with the particular absorption of a good conversation, the kind where you stop tracking time because you are too busy actually thinking. Professor Reyes asked about the food access program in the specific way that someone asks about a thing when they have read it carefully and want to understand it beyond the words pressing on implementation and scale and the challenges of sustaining volunteer infrastructure, and Simone answered from 3 years of lived knowledge, the kind that cannot be manufactured or prepared because it comes from having actually done the thing. He asked about the debate program at the community center and what she had learned from teaching younger students that she hadn't expected to learn. She told him about a 12-year-old named Marcus. She changed the name in the telling out of habit, who had argued a position he disagreed with for a practice round, and had come to her afterward, troubled by the experience, asking why you would ever argue for something you didn't believe. And what she had told him, that understanding the strongest version of an argument you disagree with is the most important tool you have for actually changing anything, because you cannot dismantle something you have not honestly understood. Professor Reyes made a note without commenting on it, which Simone had learned from debate was the sign of someone who found something genuinely worth recording. Near the end of the interview, he set down his pen and said, Miss Carter, we've received some unusual communications regarding your application over the past 24 hours. I want to give you the opportunity to address anything you feel is relevant." Simone looked at him steadily. "Yesterday, I experienced racial discrimination on my flight to Boston," she said. "A flight attendant told me in front of a full cabin that people like me don't belong in first class. I documented it. The airline then attempted to have me detained at the airport on false grounds. I believe this situation demonstrates precisely why I want to study law and public policy, because institutions are capable of using their size and resources to protect themselves from accountability, and the people who are equipped to hold them accountable are in short supply, and I intend to become one of them." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. "Thank you for your candor," Professor Reyes said, and made another note and closed her file. Outside the admissions building, the cameras were still at the main entrance. Dr. Carter stood with Simone on the side steps and asked quietly, "Do you want to say something?" Simone thought about it for exactly the length of time it took to know the answer. "Yes," she said. They walked to the main entrance together, and when the cameras oriented towards Simone, she stepped forward without hurrying, and in the clear Boston morning, she said, "I experienced discrimination on Horizon Airlines Flight 247. I documented it. I'm going to continue to advocate for the fair treatment of every passenger, regardless of their race. That's everything I'll say while this matter is ongoing." 3 follow-up questions from reporters. She did not answer any of them. She turned, walked back to where her mother and Eleanor were waiting, and got in the car. The threatening text arrived at 11 that night in the Chicago apartment. The car described by make and color the parking garage leveled the specific space information that would have required physical surveillance at the Boston hotel to obtain, and was offered not as a warning, but as a demonstration, the proof of concept of someone showing you the reach of their capability. Eleanor Voss, who had seen threats in various forms across 31 years on the bench, said, "This is the moment when they are most dangerous and most vulnerable simultaneously. They're showing their reach because they think it will produce capitulation. What it actually produces is evidence of criminal intimidation." Simone read the text a second time and felt the fear of it. The cold, specific fear of being watched in a place you thought was private. And then she set the phone down and looked at her mother and said, "What do we do?" Dr. Carter said, "We stop defending and start moving." The secured conference call that night included the largest coalition they had assembled: Eleanor James, Lena Caroline Marsh, by video Congresswoman Harlow, by audio, a former FBI agent named Thomas Reed who specialized in corporate misconduct and had been referred through Eleanor's network, and a crisis communications consultant named Sandra Kim, who had until 6 months ago been a senior member of Horizon's own PR firm, and had left after being asked to help bury a discrimination complaint that she found she could not bury with a clear conscience. Sandra's knowledge of Horizon's communications infrastructure was the kind of inside information that changes the strategic picture entirely. She knew which platforms they prioritized, which influencers were on, informal retainer, how their crisis timeline worked, where the gaps in their response capacity were. "They are running on a playbook designed for a single incident with a single complainant," she said. "They have no protocol for a coordinated simultaneous release across multiple platforms with authenticated documentation, congressional support, and a federal judge as a named witness. If you release everything at once, they can't contain it." Thomas Reed's contribution was the framework of a federal complaint around the intimidation campaign, the threatening text, the apartment entry, the professional pressure on Dr. Carter, the bank mortgage review, the attempt to interfere with the Harvard interview. "Individually, some of these things are ambiguous," he said. "Together with documentation and timing, they build a pattern of coordinated retaliation against a minor and her family for reporting discrimination. That's a serious federal matter separate from and in addition to the discrimination case itself. Lena had in the meantime found 20 former Horizon passengers who had previously settled with NDAs and were now in the context of what was emerging willing to speak on record. Each account was individual. Together, she said, they formed something that no single case had been able to form an undeniable picture of a practice that had been applied across years and geographies and flight routes to dozens of people in a pattern too consistent to be coincidence and too documented to be deniable. "We release at 8 in the morning," Dr. Carter said. "Everything simultaneously." Lena's piece. The recordings, the witness statement, the former employee, documentation, the complaint history. All of it. James said, "They'll try to suppress the recordings by claiming illegal capture." Dr. Carter said Massachusetts one-party consent authenticated chain of custody and a retired federal judge as a named witness. "Let them try." Congresswoman Harlow said, "My office will release the hearing announcement simultaneously." One morning, multiple fronts, that's more than their communications team can address in real time. The plan was set. They worked until 3 in the morning, organizing the evidence packages, Simone at the desk, still composing her own written account to accompany the recordings using the same precision she had used in the full timeline the previous night. The debate, trained clarity of someone who understands that language is most powerful when it does not reach for effect, but simply describes what happened exactly as it was. At 1:30, Lena received a call from a source inside Horizon headquarters that she took in the bathroom with the door closed and the water running. She came back out 15 minutes later with the specific expression of someone who has just received information that changes the scale of what they are dealing with. "Harold Keating held an emergency board meeting tonight," she said. "My source was in the room. He proposed terminating Diane Hartley and Derek Cole, immediately and publicly framing them as rogue employees acting without company knowledge, while simultaneously launching a diversity initiative announcement to get ahead of the narrative." A pause. And one of the board members, a new appointment 18 months in, recorded the entire meeting. The room absorbed this. She recorded Keating acknowledging he had known about previous incidents. Lena continued. Not this flight specifically, but the pattern of complaints. He acknowledged they had been handled with settlements specifically to prevent the accumulation of public record. He said in those exact words, "We didn't invent this practice, we just implemented it poorly." Eleanor said into the silence, "That is a confession. That said, Dr. Carter is what we lead with." Simone, from the desk, said nothing. She had stopped writing and was looking at the window, the city dark outside, and she was thinking about 24 people who had signed ND. As because they didn't have a federal judge across the aisle and a civil rights attorney in the row behind them who had taken the settlement, because there was no other option that looked survivable, whose silence had been used to insulate the institution from the consequences of what it kept doing to the next person. She turned back to her document and kept writing. At 8 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday in November, the world learned what had happened to Simone Carter on Horizon Airlines Flight 247. Lena Hadley's front page piece dropped first-timed to the opening of the business day, and it was the kind of journalism that gets remembered. Not because it was written with drama, but because it was written with precision. Each fact sourced and attributed the pattern assembled from 20 named former passengers and 3 former employees with documentation. The story told in the order that made its logic undeniable. The headline was simple. The subheadline was specific. The piece named names. At the same moment, the authenticated recordings went live across 6 civil rights organization platforms simultaneously, each posting with context that connected the individual incident to the larger pattern Lena's piece described. The audio was clean. Diane Hartley's voice saying, "People like you don't belong in first class," was, as Eleanor had noted the night before, not ambiguous. It did not require interpretation. It played, and you heard it, and there was nothing to do with it except understand what it was. The posts accumulated engagement with the specific velocity that happens when something resonates, because it is true, not because it is performed or staged or designed for emotion, but because it reflects an experience that millions of people recognize either because it happened to them or because they have watched it happen to someone they loved. This is what Flying While Black Looks Like became the frame through which the recordings spread, and the spread was immediate and total in the way that things spread when they arrive at a moment the world was already primed for. Congresswoman Harlow's office released the hearing announcement at 8:15. Department of Transportation Compliance Review announced at 8:40. 2 additional civil rights organizations filed formal complaints with the FAA by 9. Horizon stock opened the morning down 12%. By 10:30, it had dropped 25%. Inside Horizon headquarters, which Lena's source inside described in real time the morning had the specific quality of a controlled environment losing control. Keating called an emergency communications meeting that resulted in a press statement so obviously defensive that Lena's colleague described it in a live blog post as a company explaining why it's not doing the thing its own recordings show it doing. The statement named Diane Hartley and Derek Cole as employees who had failed to uphold company values and announced their immediate termination with full cooperation with any investigation. Within 40 minutes of the termination announcement, 3 Horizon employees posted anonymously describing written guidance that had directed exactly the behavior Hartley and Cole had exhibited. The scapegoating failed publicly in real time in a way that was worse than if it had not been attempted. Keating's televised interview at 10 o'clock was the kind of television moment that becomes definitive. He was composed, practiced, used the right language. Isolated incident. Diverse team, 0 tolerance. And then the anchor played the recording, and his composure held for the first 3 seconds, and then flinched visibly in the way that a person flinches when they hear something they were hoping they would not have to hear on camera, and then recovered and said the recording lacked context, and the anchor said, "What context changes what we just heard?" And Keating said nothing that mattered. 500 Horizon employees called in sick simultaneously by noon, a number coordinated through a private channel that Lena's team had become aware of the previous evening. The absence was covered by every major outlet as its own story. Current employees refusing to work while the airline stonewalled accountability, the internal rebellion visible and public in a way that corporate statements could not contain. In the secured hotel suite where the coalition had gathered to monitor the morning's events, Simone sat at the table with her coffee and watched the numbers and the headlines and the posts accumulate with the complicated feeling of someone who had set something in motion and was watching it move at a scale she had understood intellectually, but was experiencing for the first time as real. It was not triumph. It was heavier than triumph and more necessary, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it except stay present and clear. Her phone buzzed. An email from a Horizon executive address, not Keating's one, she didn't recognize. The subject line, Resolution Proposal. She opened it. The offer was comprehensive and substantial. 7-figure financial settlement, full scholarship to any university of choice, first-class travel for life, a personal letter of apology from the board chair, in exchange for a confidentiality agreement covering the incident and all related matters effective immediately. She read it twice. She set her phone face down on the table. "They sent a settlement offer," she said. The room looked at her. 7 figures, she said. "Full scholarship anywhere. Travel for life." A pause. NDA. She looked at Lena, who was watching her steadily. She looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with the specific quality of attention that someone gives a person when they have decided to trust their judgment and are waiting to hear it. She looked at her mother. "If we sign this," Simone said, "what happens to the 24th person and the 25th person, and everyone after that?" Her mother said nothing, because Simone was not asking her. Simone was telling the room. "Nothing happens," Simone said. "The NDA makes sure nothing happens." She picked up her phone. She moved the email to trash. "We keep going," James Park said quietly. "That's the right call." Eleanor Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to approval. Lena Hadley was already typing. The board member's recording of Keating's emergency meeting was released at 2 in the afternoon, and it landed with the specific weight of a final piece of evidence that completes a picture that was already nearly complete. Keating's voice, tired, pressured speaking to a room he thought was sealed, saying, "We didn't invent this practice, we just implemented it poorly." 9 words. Different 9 words than the ones Diane Hartley had said in that aisle, but carrying in their way an equal weight. Horizon stock closed the day down 38%. The CEO announced his immediate resignation in a statement released at 4:15, citing the need for new leadership in a time of transition, which was the corporate language for a man who had been told by his board that the alternative to resigning was being fired. Simone was not watching the markets or the resignations. She was at the hotel desk finishing the last of her Harvard prep materials, not because she needed to review them again, but because finishing things mattered to her, and she had started this before the flight, and she was going to complete it now that the flight was behind her. Her mother came to stand beside her and looked at what she was writing without reading it, just looking at the act of her daughter working, and said nothing for a long moment. "Then I'm proud of you." Simone looked up. "I know," she said. "And then I'm proud of us." 2 weeks after Horizon Airlines Flight 247 landed at Logan International Airport, Simone Carter walked into a congressional hearing room wearing a navy blazer, new, not the one from the flight, but the same shade and cut, and took her seat at the witness table with the composed steadiness of someone who has spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this and is not afraid of it. The room was full. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists occupied the press gallery with the focused stillness of people who understand they are watching something that will matter. In the public gallery, she could see Eleanor Voss in the 3rd row, upright and attentive, and James Park beside her, and behind them a row of faces she recognized from the evidence packages, former Horizon passengers who had broken their ND, as to speak, who had waited years for a moment when their individual silences might be broken together into something that could not be ignored. Congresswoman Harlow opened the hearing with the directness of someone who has held her patience for a long time and has now been given the appropriate venue to release it. Simone's testimony lasted 22 minutes. She spoke without notes for the first 12, the boarding, the pass, the water, the documentation, the meal, the aisle, the words, and referred to her written timeline only for the specific sequence of post-landing events to ensure the precision that the formal record required. She played the recording at the committee's request, and the room that had been watching with the focused attention of a serious proceeding went into a different kind of stillness when Diane Hartley's voice filled the hearing room, clear and unambiguous, and entirely without context that would have changed what it was. 2 members of the committee winced. One looked away briefly and then looked back. Congresswoman Harlow asked, "And what happened after you documented this treatment?" Simone said, "Horizon Airlines had me detained at the airport on false grounds. A crew member planted 2 liquor bottles in my bag to suggest I was drinking underage. They attempted to interfere with my college interview through a back-channel communication to the university. They entered our home without our permission while we were in Boston. They placed us under physical surveillance. They pressured my mother's supervisors at the Justice Department through congressional contacts, and they arranged a review of our home mortgage through a partner bank." She paused. "All of this because I refused to be silent about how they treated me on that flight." The room was very quiet. Horizon's legal representation seated at the adjacent table had arrived with a defense built on the premise that Diane Hartley and Derek Cole had acted without company knowledge or authorization. This defense lasted approximately 20 minutes under cross-examination before it encountered the internal training documents, the board members' recording of Keating's emergency meeting, and the 24 complaint files that James Park's team had compiled, and which showed in case after case the same coded language the same escalation, the same settlement, and silence. When the committee displayed the internal training document on the hearing room screen, the premium cabin culture preservation language, with Horizon's internal approval chain visible in the document metadata, and asked Horizon's counsel whether the company's position was that its crew acted without company authorization. The answer that followed was audible as the sound of a defense collapsing. Harold Keating did not appear. He had submitted a doctor's letter citing medical leave, which the committee accepted with the specific, wordless skepticism of people who know what it means when a man is unavailable for the one day he most needs to be present. Diane Hartley and Derek Cole had been terminated the morning the recordings went public 2 weeks ago, in a statement that described them as employees who had failed to uphold company values. Whistleblowers had immediately and publicly documented that they had upheld company policy, not failed to uphold company values, and that distinction had spent 2 weeks being confirmed in detail. Their termination was formally confirmed at the hearing as permanent, and the committee was clearly not done with either of them as private individuals. By the time the hearing broke for recess, the Department of Transportation had already issued a formal statement expanding its compliance review to all federally regulated passenger carriers, citing the evidence of industry-wide practices revealed by the Horizon case. Dr. Carter reinstated to her Justice Department position 2 days after the Keating recording surfaced, and the congressional pressure campaign against her was exposed for what it was named to chair the task force that would develop the new federal standards. Horizon's stock, which had been attempting a cautious recovery over the previous week on the hope that the scapegoating of Hartley and Cole might draw a line, fell sharply again on the hearing's opening day and did not recover. Credit agencies downgraded the airline's debt rating to junk. Bankruptcy proceedings began the following week. The new federal standard that emerged from the task force, the one that mandated anti-bias training, transparent complaint reporting, and independent oversight across every federally regulated carrier, was named the Carter Standard in the final committee report. Simone found out about the naming from her mother on the phone in her Harvard dormitory 6 months later. "They named it after you," she told her mother. "They named it after the case," Dr. Carter said, "which you built." 6 months after Flight 247. Simone Carter was standing in Harvard Yard in a crimson sweatshirt that she had earned the right to wear not because of what happened on that flight, but because of everything she had done before it, and the morning was cold and clear and full of the particular beginning of something quality that she associated with her mother's phrase about showing up ready. The Harvard acceptance letter had arrived 3 weeks after her interview. Full merit scholarship. Professor Reyes's evaluation, noting her clarity of purpose and her ability to hold composure under conditions designed to produce something else. She had read the letter twice standing in the kitchen in Chicago, and then she had called her mother, who was in a meeting in Washington, and picked up anyway. She had not cried. She had simply felt the weight of it land all the early mornings at the dry cleaner, all the tutoring sessions, all the hours refining the debate program and the food access program and the interview prep, and understood that the weight was appropriate, because the thing it corresponded to was real. The Carter Standard was now in effect across every major federally regulated carrier in the country. Anti-bias training mandatory and third-party administered. Independent oversight of premium cabin service practices. A transparent complaint reporting mechanism that could not be quietly resolved with an NDA before generating a formal record. Airlines had resisted, of course. Trade groups had submitted comments. Legal teams had proposed modifications, and the standard had been revised through the normal process, and had still ended up being what it needed to be, because the evidence assembled in the Horizon case was the kind of evidence that makes the cost of resistance higher than the cost of compliance. Harold Keating was facing federal civil rights charges and a separate criminal investigation into the car brake, tampering the latter proceeding through the courts on the cooperation of 2 former Horizon security contractors who had accepted reduced sentences in exchange for full testimony. His lawyers were working a plea. The outcome was not yet determined, but the direction of it was clear. Diane Hartley and Derek Cole had been terminated. Both were subjects of pending civil rights proceedings. Their names were in the formal record in ways that would follow them. Eleanor Voss had established the Voss Foundation Scholarship Funding, the first cohort of minority students pursuing civil rights law. 12 scholars beginning the following fall, each selected through a process that prioritized first-generation college students from communities with documented barriers to legal education. She had asked Simone to serve on the selection committee, which Simone had agreed to with the specific quiet pleasure of someone being given exactly the kind of work they want to do. James Park's civil rights practice had a waiting list. Lena Hadley's investigation had won 2 major journalism awards and was still ongoing, having expanded from Horizon to the wider landscape of premium cabin discrimination across the transportation sector. The accountability that had started on one Tuesday afternoon flight was spreading outward in the way that real accountability spreads not cleanly or quickly but persistently in the direction of the evidence. Simone thought about all of this sometimes in the evenings in her dormitory in the particular quiet before bed when the day's work was done and the next day's hadn't started yet. She thought about what had been taken from her on that flight. The blazer, the interview materials, the first-class experience her mother had meant as a celebration, the hours of sustained indignity, and she thought about what had not been taken, her composure, her recordings, her mother's voice on the phone saying, "You did everything right," and the particular knowledge that she would carry for the rest of her life, that she had faced something designed to break her, and had not broken. She had not broken. She had documented and held steady and built something from the evidence of what had been done to her, and then she had walked into a congressional hearing room and said what had happened in her own words clearly and without embellishment, and the room had gone still because the truth, stated plainly, has a weight that nothing else replicates. She was going to be a lawyer. She had known this before the flight in the abstract way that a person knows the direction they are heading, but she knew it differently now, not as an aspiration, but as a fact, as something already decided as the thing she was already becoming. The email arrived on a Sunday evening in late September, during the first weeks of Simone's first semester at Harvard, when the campus had the particular quality of a beginning. The air with that early fall edge to it, the yard still green, the sense of everything being in its first form before the season changed it. The sender's name was Natalie Cole. Simone read the subject line, "I hope this is okay," and opened it. "Hi, Simone. My name is Natalie Cole. I'm your assigned roommate for the semester, and I've been trying to figure out how to write this email for 3 weeks. Derek Cole is my father. I know what he did on your flight. I've spent the summer trying to understand how someone I have loved my entire life could treat another person the way he treated you, and I don't have an answer yet, but I've been doing the work of trying to find one. I requested to be assigned to your room deliberately. I wanted to tell you that, before you found out some other way. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to be honest with you from the first moment, rather than pretend to be a stranger who happens to share your living space. If this is too much, if you need a different roommate, if the idea of sharing a room with me is something you can't make space for, I completely understand. I mean that without any expectation. You don't owe me anything, and especially not this. If you're willing to try, I want you to know that I'll try too, with honesty and without expecting you to carry the weight of what my father did. I admire you more than I have words for. Whatever you decide." Natalie Simone read the email once. Then she set her phone down and looked out her dormitory window at the yard below the last of the afternoon light falling across the old stone and the grass, the other students moving through it with the loose, purposeful energy of people beginning something. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon in November seat, 3A, the ruined blazer, the walk down the jet bridge with every eye in the cabin following her. She thought about the security office and the liquor bottles she had never seen before in her life, and Diane Hartley's thin smile. She thought about Eleanor Voss standing in the cabin, in the voice of someone who had spent 3 decades being heard, and James Park's business card pressed into her palm, and her mother walking through a door in a tailored suit with her credentials already in her hand, and the specific particular moment in a beige room when Harold Keating understood what he had set in motion. She thought about 24 people who had signed non-disclosure agreements because there was no other option that looked survivable. She thought about the 25th person and everyone after that who would now fly first class on any federally regulated carrier with an independent oversight mechanism in place, not because of grand gestures, but because one 17-year-old had pressed record and stayed present and had not looked away from what was being done to her. She thought about what kind of person she intended to be. Not what had been done to her, but what she chose to do with it. She thought about the conversation her mother had described from the Horizon settlement offer the moment she had moved the email to trash, and she thought about what it had meant to make that choice, and what it had cost, and what it had built. She picked up her phone and wrote 3 sentences. Natalie, thank you for your honesty. I needed to hear it the way you wrote it. I've learned this year that the most important conversations are the ones that don't come easily. I'm willing to try if you are. See you tomorrow. She read it back once. She pressed send. Then she set the phone down and called her mother, and when Dr. Carter answered from Washington from the middle of a week that Simone knew had been long and difficult and consequential, her voice came through with the warmth that it always carried when it was just the two of them, that particular quality of home that does not require a specific geography. How are you? Her mother asked. I'm good, Simone said. And she meant it not in the managed way she had told Eleanor Voss she was fine on the flight, not in the composed under-pressure way she had answered every question in that hearing room, but in the plain, quiet way of someone who is in the right place and knows it. Outside her window, the yard was going gold in the early evening light, and somewhere across the city, the harbor reflected the last of the day. And tomorrow, her roommate was arriving, and the semester was beginning, and the work she was here to do, the long, careful, necessary work of understanding how institutions fail people and what it takes to make them better, was just starting. She sat in the window for a while after the call ended, looking at the yard, feeling the particular weight of the last year settle into something that was not finished but was solid, something she could build on. She had not been broken. She had documented and held steady and told the truth in a room full of people who needed to hear it. That was enough to start with. That was more than enough. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up quietly with evidence and composure and refusal to be erased is one of the most powerful things a person can do. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who faced extraordinary injustice and refused to be silent. Like this video, if you believe that the truth stated plainly always has weight and that the people who carry it deserve to be heard.